healer in 8.1. And I always say I don't like to guess, but my opinion is the Mistweaver Monk. Why? Because Mistweaver Monks didn't really receive any nerfs except a little bit of a nerf to Enveloping Mist, which does not include Surging Mist. We also saw no changes to Wave the Crane in their damage output, and this is always the thing with Mistweavers, and it's been the same issue since Legion. Whenever a new patch comes out, people don't know how much damage classes are going to be dealing. People don't know, what the best comps are. People aren't really sure of the exact meta. You can get an idea, but the meta hasn't, developed well enough to where you're going to see specific comps, really outshine other comps. And we're getting to that point where they are now. But whenever that's the case, the Mistweaver Monk has always just been the best healer for the first few weeks or so. It's always been that way. I can't even think of a patch where the patch started and Mistweaver Monks were just absolute trash. They're always the strongest healer for the first 2 weeks because they just have the highest healing output out of any class in the entire game, and it's almost always been that way since Legion. They just have extremely high burst healing, and that helps combat classes that are dealing really crazy damage. Like Death Knights were dealing really crazy damage, still are dealing pretty crazy damage. Elemental Shamans, Moonkins, whenever someone's dealing, huge chunks of damage, burst damage, you always want to have a healer that can recover from that, and that's always been the Mistweaver Monk. Now, Mistweaver Monks are going to have the same issue going forward because they don't have that much utility. They don't have a lot of utility. They did gain some in BFA with things like Disarm, giving Leg Sweep as a baseline ability, and then now having Ring of Peace is something you almost always spec into. This adds a little bit of utility, Touch of the Mystic or the Mystic Touch Mystic Touch, whatever it's called. It increases the damage of physical damage on that target by 5% when you deal damage to that target, so it's a nice little buff for utility. But the problem is Mistweavers do not have any damage reduction, and I'll talk about Burst of Life in a second and how that kind of fixes that right now. But they don't have any damage reduction, right? They just have insane healing output. And what happens is when the healing is just too high, and I made a video about this earlier, I might put it on the screen somewhere. This is like a year ago I made this video, or in the link in the description box below, I might put it there. When you have too much healing output and you don't have any defensive utility, the only thing you can do to tweak the class mid-expansion to either buff it or nerf it is to either buff or nerf their healing output or their mana regen. Those two are tied very closely together. But what happens is the healing output is too high. So what Blizzard is going to do is they're just going to simply nerf the healing output or nerf the mana regen. If you nerf healing output, you directly nerf mana, your mana, because you're having to heal more, and you don't have any damage reduction for your allies, so you have to just heal through it. All this damage, full on damage, no Earth Shield, no Earthen Wall, no pain suppression, no Bark Skin. You don't have any damage reduction that you can just throw out there, other than really Cocoon, which is a shield. So when you nerf their healing, they're going to faster. And this is the same thing that happened in Legion. Mistweaver Monks in Legion, until they had this Wave the Crane spec, would in the first couple minutes of the game. And that's what I expect going into the next season or the next patch. If Blizzard decides to nerf this class, if they decide to nerf this class, they're just going to nerf the mana or the healing. And then they're just going to go very fast. And they'll probably go back to the melee tier where they heal and they're responsible for healing like double melee like Turbo, where they can burst fast enough to where the mana doesn't matter as much. But right now Mistweavers are being used in every single comp. You're seeing them everywhere because of their insane healing output. Wave the Crane adds a lot of burst, and they still have decent utility, just not as much as compared to some of the other healers that have Purge, Cyclone, Roots, Vortex, whatever, tons of utility spells, Fear, Mind Control, Mass Dispel. Those team utility spells allow most of the time the other healers to outshine the Mistweaver, but right now no one can compete with the Mistweaver healing output. No one can compete with the Wave the Crane damage and healing. Some people think it's bugged. I actually don't think that it is bugged in dampening. Maybe the numbers are a little bit off, but what I will say, if you are hitting for 20 to 30k Rising Sun kicks as a Mistweaver and you're still healing for 200% of that, you're going to be dealing or healing for a lot. Like, there's just no way of getting around that. It's going to instantly top somebody almost no matter what. So I don't think there's that many bugs with Wave the Crane. There might be one. I expect the class to get nerfed, just how it always is. I would like Blizzard to look at this because it's the same model we had in Legion and try and correct some of this going into the next expansion, so we don't have the same cycle where Mistweaver is really strong because they have the most healing, and then they nerf it, and then they too fast, and they go down to the lower tiers. And if you think I'm single-handedly getting Mistweaver's nerfed by saying this, I main a Mistweaver, and I've been playing it for over 3 years now. If you're new to my channel, that is my main. That is the class I have the most experience on for the past 3 years now. It's just everywhere. I hear Sea-Doo complaining about it. I hear everybody complaining about it. Even though they're playing the class, I can admit if a class is too strong. I just know what's going to happen in the future and how they're going to get nerfed, and I would just hope that Blizzard does something to try and correct this so it's not the same cycle for Mistweavers every single expansion. Now moving on to the S tier, once again, there is no particular order to the S tier in some of these classes. I'm going to speed through these because honestly, these classes are just not Mistweaver, and that's what separates them right now. I don't want to dive too much into the class because that's the reason why they're not in the S plus tier, is that Mistweaver is just that much stronger than the rest of the healers. Now, if Mistweaver gets nerfed, then I can really dive into what separates the rest of these healers. But Restoration Shaman right now is pretty good, I would say, into this meta because they have Chain Heal, which is good for recovery purposes and dispelling Shadow Priest dots. I mean, you can get so many dispels off in a single match using Healing Rain and Chain Heal heals for a ridiculous amount. They're still pretty mana efficient and very tanky. I think Restoration Shaman is still a very solid healer. They did get some nerfs going into 8.1 because they were way too strong for way too long. So I expect Mistweavers to get nerfed sooner than Resto Shamans did. Resto Shamans were like one of the best healers by far, I would say, for a long time because of just how mana efficient they were and how the fact that they didn't have to cast at all, and they were almost unkillable in Ghost Wolf. They were unkillable, they never had to cast, and they never went And no one really complained too much about Resto Shamans, but people just don't like Mistweavers, I would say, because their playstyle with this insane burst healing is just not fun to play against, and I completely understand that. So my one weakness with Resto Shaman is right now is that they have to cast more, and sometimes that goes against you, and getting locked out on a crucial chain heal or not having enough healing output when you not relying on Riptide as much makes a big difference. I think having things like grounding and wind shear are still very useful. I think having things like purge is still very useful. Once again, I don't think there's anything really bad about Resto Shaman. I would just say that they're just not Mistweavers, and once again, that's why I'm separating the two classes into two different tiers. Now, moving on to Holy Paladins in the S tier, a lot of people were saying that Holy Paladin, and I heard Peekaboo say it, and people were like, oh, Peekaboo says Holy Paladins are bad. From a person that plays, almost only a healer, I wouldn't say Holy Paladins are bad. I just think that Mistweaver is that much better once again. And the biggest strength of Holy Paladins right now is number one, they did get some changes, right? So in 8.1, they lost their ability to have 2 Blessing of Sacrifice or sacrifices. Ultimate Sacrifice, you're not having 2 sacks is pretty huge, and I totally agree with that, making them much weaker than they were, I would say, before to a certain extent. And in the comps that they played, right? In the comps that they played, they really needed to have those 2 Blessings of Sac, right? When you're playing like Rogue Mage Pally, having 2 sacks for your Fire Mage or your Rogue is pretty huge when fighting certain comps. I think the comp is still really good. I think it's still good with Discipline Priest as well. I think the biggest strength of Holy Paladins right now is their healing has been increased, right? Their Holy Light and Flash of Light has been increased. So healing increase is pretty huge. But their biggest strength right now is that they're really tanky. They're hard to take down, especially in 2v2s. They're not as easy to kill as they used to be, especially in 2v2s. I think they're like not a target that you can actually easily kill, and they never go I mean, their mana efficiency is through the roof. I mean, the match can go on and I'm on my monk or I'm on any other healer, and that dude's still literally at 99 to 100% mana. I mean, it's insane. They actually spend 0 mana, and that's good in drawn out fights. Having their increased healing output with Flash of Light and Holy Light, having things like Melee Wing still dealing decent damage, but as a good recovery tool, not as good as Wave of the Crane, I would say, but still a good recovery tool. Having, increased healing once again, and then being that mana efficient, I think Holy Paladin is still a very strong healer. I think it's still good in RMP, RM Pala. I think it's still good in caster comps. Those are the comps that you're seeing a lot of, mostly caster comps right now. But I would just say Holy Paladin is still in a decent spot. Divine Favor getting a nice buff too. Divine Favor making it so that you can't get interrupted, and also provides, I spelled Divine wrong. I can't spell for shit anymore. Divine Favor is still being a very strong tool, like it was in Legion, increasing your healing output on that spell, but also making it so you don't get sheared or counterspelled on crucial heals that you need to get out, and not having 2 Blessing of Sac, not having Ultimate Sacrifice with 2 charges of that, making it so you have to cast more, just like Resto Shamans, having Divine Favor, and then also Resto Shamans also having clear casting. They're very similar playstyles, I would say, in some aspects. Cleanse the Weak, having a Shadow Resist aura for Holy Paladins. I mean, they're very similar in a lot of ways. One of them has Purge. One of them has, I would say, more life-saving cooldowns. I mean, almost to an extent. So, and I think that you'll find that as a common theme through almost all these healers that I'll name on today's video. Now, moving on to Discipline Priest. Discipline Priest, a lot of people were saying that they were going to be trash and they don't do as much damage anymore, and that's how they were supposed to be mana efficient and they were supposed to heal. But I actually think Discipline Priest is still really strong because they still deal damage. They still have great team utility with things like Purge, MD, MC, Mind Control, Mass Dispel. If you don't know what I'm talking about, those are team utility spells that Discipline Priests have. They still have their Big Barrier. Big Barrier is responsible, or it allows them to live during very desperate moments. When they put in long CC chains, they can pre-barrier things. They can use barrier to save almost anybody. It's 70% damage reduction. But Depth of Shadow, which is the first thing I have listed here, is a Azurite trait. And I think this Azurite trait is actually responsible for Discipline Priest still being pretty relevant in today's meta. What it does is when you use your Purge the Wicked or your Shadow Word Pain dot, Purge the Wicked replaces Shadow Word Pain, when you dot individual enemies and you have this dot running, you build up a stack. And as this thing stacks up, it's going to buff your next Shadow Mend by a certain number. Now, if you have things like Twist of Fate and you're falling very low, let's say you're playing a Discipline Priest and you're weaving in damage, you're penanting, you're smiting, you know, whatever, you're getting shields going, you're dotting, you're purging, whatever you're doing, and then a person falls in the Twist of Fate range, you can go for a Shadow Mend, and that Shadow Mend will easily hit for like almost 80,000, which is almost an instant top. Now, Mistweavers can do that pretty consistently, I would say. You know, Resto Shamans can do that with things like Chain Heal maybe, but not as, I wouldn't say it's as bursty and just one casted heal as Discipline Priest. Discipline Priests are still really strong for their team utility. Once again, their damage, they're still good in certain comps, I would say. They're still actually pretty good into dampening comps, I would say. If you're fighting like a double caster, Discipline Priest actually does pretty well if you know how to play using your damage to team heal. It's not as effective as it once was, but Depth of Shadow I think really makes up for that, and I still think they have their place in the meta. And I wouldn't really separate them between Resto Shamans and Holy Paladins at this moment. So I think they belong most certainly in the S tier. If you're not playing this trait, you probably don't feel that way, but if you're playing this trait, then you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about, unless you're playing like Battlefield Focus and 2v2s, which it also is really, really strong. Now, moving on to the final class in the S tier. This could be an A tier class to some people, and I could put Holy Priest, a little bit of a teaser in the B tier. I just think Resto Druids are still struggling. I think Nourish was a great change, and Nourish is a very strong heal. I just feel like in my mind, they do have some great utility, I should say, right? They have things like Cyclone, Roots, Vortex, Thorns. Cenarian Ward, I think, is a very strong talent to be played in certain situations. I think Nourish was a nice change. I think they're good in dampener comps. I think they're going to be good in playing with like maybe, you know, a Death Knight and a Shadow Priest. I think they're going to be good in double caster comps. But I just feel like there's nothing that separates them in my mind from some of the other healers, especially Mistweaver. I feel like Mistweaver is just a better version of Resto Druid at this point that does lack a little bit of utility. But like with, for example, Revival got a stealth buff recently in 8.1. Some people don't know this. Revival cleanses all magical and harmful effects and also heals. But the healing when going from Legion to BFA initially, the Revival heal was just like minuscule. I felt like you didn't even heal with it when you used it. And then in the patch notes, they didn't talk about it at all. Go figure. But it got buffed, and now it heals for like an absorbent amount. Where, you know, it reminds me of Tranquility, but it's just, Revival is just way better. It's instant, and it heals for more than Tranquility does. Tranquility recently got a nerf. I think Nourish wasn't enough for Druids to be in a better spot. I think they still struggle when they get stuck, but so do Mistweavers. They're very similar in my mind to Mistweavers, just a little bit more CC, but less healing at this point, I would say. So right now, you could argue that, you know, Resto Druids are going to be in the A tier, and then maybe I put Holy Priest in a B tier. But for now, this is my list. I think Resto Druids still have a place in certain comp matchups, and I think if you're an exceptional Resto Druid, you can perform well playing in almost any comp. It's just, I don't think they're as strong as some of the other healers, but we'll see how the patch rolls out and what happens in next season. Maybe I'll change this list in the next coming weeks or so. All right, now moving on to the A tier. You can see all the tiered classes here. We have A tier, S tier, Mistweaver S plus tier, every other healer except Holy Priest in the S tier, as they're very similar in my mind. Maybe Resto Druids could be argued another way. And then Holy Priest. Now, people were saying Holy Priest was going to be super strong in 8.1. Yes, Greater Heal is very, very strong. And yes, they are good into caster comps. Yes, when you're playing with like another two casters, they're still very strong. But the problem with Holy Priest, and it's still their issue, is they just die when getting trained. I mean, I think they're even worse than Discipline Priest. They just die when getting trained by any like double melee. Walking Dead, for example, if you're fighting a Walking Dead, you're just gonna flop over. And I think I think Discipline Priests are even better at surviving in those situations. And because of this, and because of their ability to only play caster comps in my mind, it's hard for me to give them a spot in some of these other tiers. I mean, almost every other healer can be played in almost any comp, whereas Holy Priest can only be played in caster comps. And when they are played in caster comps, they can do pretty well. But the problem is as you're climbing the ladder, you're going to run into a lot of double melee. You're gonna run into Walking Deads, Turbos, and any of those comps can just run at you, and if they can kill you fast enough, it doesn't matter how much damage your casters are doing. If they're paired with like a Mistweaver Monk, for example, they're probably not going to die in the first couple minutes or so, and that's all that it's going to take for you to fall as a Holy Priest. So right now, Greater Heal is really strong. I want to talk about that, or at least mention that. It is very strong, but you can only get so many of them off if you are getting trained, and if you're not getting trained, they're probably hitting one of your casters, and that might be where you shine the best. But because you're likely going to get trained, moving up the ladder, I just can't imagine Holy Priest being in some of these other tier spots, especially when the lower brackets always seem to have a lot of double melee going on in those areas. And then also the fact that you can only play a certain comp style, I think, is one of their weaknesses. So for me, I just don't see Holy Priest as that strong. I'm not saying that they're not strong. I just don't think they're as strong or as well-rounded as some of the other healers on this list, including the Mistweaver Monk. And there it is, ladies and gentlemen. That is my 8.1 BFA healer tier list for PvP as of January 1st, 2019. Happy New Year, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. This is my list. If you guys have any comments or questions on my list, you can leave them in the comment section below. But this is what I generally believe to be the rankings in terms of healer. Again, there's no particular order, but I will say Mistweaver is just really strong right now, and I expect to see some changes in the future. And when that does happen, I'll be sure to update this video. With that being said, that is going to do it for this video. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any more questions or concerns or comments, you can leave those in the comment section below, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Be on the lookout for my new Mistweaver guide. Speaking of Mistweavers, a new Mistweaver guide coming out this week or the next couple of days or so. Big shout out to all my Patreon supporters out there who've been supporting me on Patreon this whole time. Without you guys, this channel wouldn't be possible. And if you're interested in supporting me on Patreon, the link is in the description box below. And for supporting me on Patreon, you can also earn yourself some coaching. Trying to miss me on my Twitch live stream or answer all of your guys' questions in depth. Do not forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.